So first of all, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's really wonderful to see you, to have you with us, to learn from these incredible speakers. My name is Kylie Davidson. I'm the coordinator of this program, and I cannot believe that we are closing out its 6th year. These past 9 months have absolutely flown by, not to mention my 3 years as coordinator of this tremendous program. Throughout this past year, we've learned from really incredible speakers, Tina Vasquez, Rebecca Mark, Babita Patel, and Stacey Tisdale. We've asked big questions about movement journalism, social justice, and finding our purpose in our careers. We've sharpened our skills, learning how to pivot our experiences to new positions, and reflecting on the thoughts and lessons that shape our financial decisions. We've expanded our networks, learned far more trivia than we probably ever anticipated at the start of this program year, offered advice, and strengthened a community committed to creating a more just media industry. And to think we did it all virtually. As we approached a virtual year, there were questions of how we would adapt, primarily if we could recreate all that this program is through Zoom and our computer screens. But it goes without saying that the answer is a resounding yes, because the vision of this program and the incredible people that we are so fortunate to work with far surpass any challenge we may face. And this vision comes from the leadership of our late director, Alison R. Bernstein, to support young women throughout media so that we may transform the industry. Alison's guidance and the tireless work of supporters and trailblazers ensured we could create spaces, virtually or in person, to tackle big ideas in intimate conversations, envision a better future of media, and define the steps necessary to get us there. But what really shapes this program each and every single year is all of you, those who've participated in this program as mentors, mentees, alums, workshop leaders, event speakers. Your generosity and resolve are unmatched. And that's what forms the heart of this program, the community that we all build together. And so tonight, we get to celebrate all that this year has been, and we're very fortunate to conclude the year with an amazing conversation with really remarkable speakers. Together, they'll explore their visions for a transformed media, discuss the power of the industry to create change, and consider how mentorship plays a role in this transformation. And it's my honor to introduce all 3 of our speakers to you. Andrea González-Ramírez is a New York-based independent journalist from Vega Alta, Puerto Rico, who reports on politics, gender, race, activism, and more. She's also the founder of the Latinas in Journalism Mentorship Program. Andrea's work has appeared in Gen by Medium, Refinery 29, NPR's Latino USA, El Diario Nueva York, Centro Voices, and Diálogo, among others. She has also been featured as an expert commentator on CBSN, MSNBC, WNYC's The Takeaway, and other outlets. Andrea is one of the authors of AOC, The Fearless Rise and Powerful Resonance of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from St. Martin's Press, and a 2019-2020 Ida B. Wells Fellow at Type Investigations. She holds a Master of Journalism with a concentration in international reporting from the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, and a degree in Journalism and Sociology from the University of Puerto Rico. Alicia Bell, the Media 2070 Director at Free Press, is a proud Southerner, community organizer, and media transformation doula working at the intersections of Afrofuturist imagination, journalism, land, food, and all the spaces in between. At Free Press, Alicia dreams, strategizes, and organizes to win media reparations and to create a media ecosystem where everyone can thrive, ideally much earlier than the year 2070. They've arrived where they are via a path that includes electoral organizing in North Carolina, parent, student, and youth organizing in New York, and housing, health, and police accountability organizing in Oakland. Alicia is also a parent, a member of a local gardening collective, and a lover of big bodies of nature. Whitney Pennington Rodgers is an award-winning journalist and the current affairs curator at TED, where she curates and interviews speakers who address the most urgent topics of the moment. Prior to joining TED, Whitney was a video journalist at NBC News, where she produced for NBC's primetime news magazines Dateline NBC and Sunday Night. Whitney earned a DuPont Columbia Award and a News and Documentary Emmy for her contributions to the Dateline NBC hour, The Cosby Accusers Speak, an extensive group interview with 27 of the women who accused entertainer Bill Cosby of sexual misconduct. Whitney has worked at NBC's in-house production company, Peacock Productions, The Today Show, Nightly News, Rock Center, and New Jersey-centric public affairs shows, Caucus, New Jersey, and One-on-One with Steve Adubato. Prior to beginning her career in media, she had a short stint as a fourth grade teacher at Teach for America. And we're also incredibly lucky to have had Whitney serve as a mentor in this program as well. Whitney received her Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers University, and she completed her Master of Journalism at the University of California at Berkeley, where she produced a documentary about recruitment of non-Black students at historically Black colleges and universities. I can't think of a better way to end this program year, and I'm so thrilled to learn from Andrea, Alicia, and Whitney, as I know all of you are. So please join me in giving them the warmest welcome. And Whitney, I will hand it off to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Kylie, for that introduction. And hello, Andrea and Alicia. I'm so thrilled to join you both in conversation tonight. And you know, I, as Kylie mentioned, was part of the Media Mentoring Program as a mentor, and I'm so excited that this is the way that we'll finish this year in thinking about media and movements. And I think that that's probably a really great place to start. You know, this is such an interesting year, as Kylie mentioned, all of the things that we've all experienced through this pandemic and accomplished during this pandemic. And it's sort of really interesting to think about how movements have played a part in this and what role media has played as well. And so just in thinking about the title of this program, I'd love to start with just asking each of you what comes to mind when you think of that pairing, media and movements. How do you see the two intersect? And so I'll let either of you start, I guess, whichever one of you feels most moved by the question.
Thank you, Whitney. I'm so excited to be here as well. I've been in these email virtual spaces with y'all, and so it's really lovely to see your faces. You know, when you ask that question about movements and media, the thing that it made me think about is how we can complicate the idea of a movement, to think about what that means and what it constitutes. I think currently when we think about movements, we're thinking a lot about things that kind of fall in the realm of social justice, social good, kind of transformational change, those kinds of things, right? And so it falls oftentimes into like movements against climate disaster, or movements for environmental justice, or movements against racism and movements for racial liberation. And those are all movements and all really powerful and really strong movements. And at the same time, we have to consider that there are other movements that are movements away from a future where we all get to thrive and we all get to be well. And those are white supremacy movements. Those are movements for the status quo. And folks don't oftentimes think about those things as movements, right? But there's so much organizing, so much culture shifting and culture making and narrative creation that goes into how those things happen. When we think about kind of histories of white supremacy, there was no way that it was built without people being able to utilize journalism and television and movies and radio and artistry and craft to make it possible. And the same is true when we think about kind of this movement towards the status quo and keeping things the way they always were, whatever that means. And it doesn't even really mean anything, but it doesn't have to, because there's been a culture created around it so that it doesn't have to mean anything. And so when I think about media and movements, I think that it means that all media and necessarily is situated within a movement. All media and all journalism and all media creation is situated within something that's either trying to kind of maintain the status quo, create a world that's more divisive and that's more harmful, or create a world where we all get to thrive. And I think for me, there's like a clear winner in those three, which kind of movements I want to be connected to. But I think that it requires us to think about what the impact of our work is in those different kind of movements and categories.
You said some things that I'd love to touch on later, but Andrea, I'd love to hear what these things call to mind for you as well.
Yeah, I think that lately I've been thinking a lot about looking inwards and and like I'm not in a newsroom anymore, but like what our newsrooms do and how movements play within our newsrooms, right? And what type of forces exist out there that either maintain the status quo or push against it. So I think that in many ways we talk about journalism as not only a service to the public and a way to hold the powerful accountable, but often we don't talk about like holding ourselves accountable for the type of work we do and the type of stories we cover and even how we treat our workers. So when I think of media movements, I think of collective organizing. I think about, disrupting things like the fact that there's barely any people of color and like the high levels of like a lot of our newsrooms, the fact that often we see people be punished for covering something that's close to their identity if they're typically from a marginalized community, right? So when I think about media movements, it's like, how can we fight out against those forces? And as Alicia so beautifully and eloquent put, how we can create good and in many ways, imagine a better media and imagine a better journalism that not only serves our audiences, but also empowers our workers as well.
And I think, thank you both for that. I think one thing that's that I find really interesting about what you both shared is this idea about how movements can be used as a force for good or a force for not good, right? And how I think it's really interesting how we've seen so much of people living in bubbles, if you will, where you maybe don't necessarily know whether or not you are part of a movement that is positive or negative, or perhaps your sense of that is skewed based on the circumstances surrounding you and the world that has been created for you by the media, right? This idea that perhaps the media one group consumes is different from the media another group consumes, and so your sense of what is right and what is good may be very different from someone else's. And so I think it makes me wonder what is the current state of the media as you see it in terms of its ability to help people grasp sort of where they stand in the world and how they relate to others. How do you feel? Where do you feel like we are right now as an industry?
I can go first. I think we're in a very interesting time, to say the least. On one hand, yeah, the status quo has prevailed for a long time, and there's been some pushback, especially among a new generation of journalists, to kind of shake things up a little bit in terms of what we understand as objectivity, how we cover certain communities, what is to be biased or what is to be an expert, so many ways in like which we don't want to do this equivalent of, something like climate change is real. Why are we giving space to someone who says it's not when it goes against the science, right? So I think that there's like a potential for shaking things up and really re-examining and looking at ourselves and being like, how can we be better? But our industry is also like, hella broke. so many newsrooms have shut down, we've lost so many outlets. In so many ways, we're doing more and more and more with less every single time, right? And that also impacts the quality of the work we're able to put out there, the quality of, the ways that we cover certain stories versus others. And I think that can be, I don't want to use the word depressing, but almost depressing when you start thinking a lot about it, right? It's just like we are trying to create something here, but like the stakes are so high and there's so many people who are invested in keeping things as they are, right? Because it benefits certain systems of power. So yeah, being in media, like when I do my mentee calls, I am pretty honest with my mentees. It's like, well, this is important work. This can be really rewarding work, but it's also hard work, not only because of the subject matters we cover or like the way journalism is done, but also because we're in an industry that's, consistently in flux, consistently like struggling. And unless we all get together and start using our brains to kind of figure out how to get out of this mess is going to be really hard for like new generations of journalists. Sorry, that was a super downer.
No, I mean, say what you feel. I think that there's no reason to sugarcoat, right? And Alicia, do you have a reaction to that or thoughts of your own around that?
Well, first of all, I have a million thanks for Andrea for taking the first answer, because when you asked that question, my brain shot so many places. I was like, and it was a lot of like, ugh, at all. So all of the things you were saying definitely filled in the like what that meant. And I think I want to lift up, there's this really incredible organization called Reframe. And we had a chance to work with them recently around some of the work we're doing around media reparations. And one of the things they did is they scraped across the internet and to figure out kind of like what is media. And one of the things that they found was that there was no collective public definition for media. That there were different groups of people who had different definitions of that or saw different pieces of that, but there was no kind of collective understanding, which was really interesting to me because journalism specifically and news and information is like one of the things that's written into the Constitution of the United States. So it's interesting to have this kind of balance of this thing that's written into this document that is considered a kind of foundational document of this nation, and then simultaneously there not being a collective public definition of what media is. And so that's been part of our work, is really defining what media is it like, because it is journalism, it is news, it is information, but it is also entertainment, and it is also television and music and film, and it's also technology and social media. And all of these things are doing this really like ongoing continuous weave to influence each other. And honestly, none of those ecosystems is really doing great. So they're, in terms of uplifting folks who have historically been marginalized by systems of oppression, in terms of that creation of a world where we all get to be well and we all experience kind of abundance. Because and so I think that's the state of it, right? Is that it's not doing well, and at a more specific level, when it kind of comes to journalism and news, I think one of the things we hear a lot and talk about a lot is this kind of decline in local news or lack of support for local journalism or investigative news or investigative journalism and things like that. And some of the work that I've been able to connect with that connects those kind of tech social media places to journalism is saying that it's that lack of local journalism, that lack of news, that is what breeds the grounds for disinformation, because that disinformation kind of creeps in and becomes divisive and harmful, because there is a lack of local journalism. But at the same time, we know that local journalism hasn't served so many people for so long. And so it's not a surprise that it's not thriving, because the demographics of our country are shifting, people's needs are shifting, people's desires are shifting. And so when we build a system that's not meant for all people, that's not meant for the pluralism that we have currently, then of course it will falter. And when we know that disinformation kind of thrives in that faltering, then it ends up being a system and a failure of its own creation. And I think that's one of the hardest pieces to reckon with. But it also means that we can kind of pinpoint and identify where things went wrong along the way to figure out what transformation, what repair, what reconciliation looks like into a future where there is journalism, news, information, all kinds of other kinds of media, technology, internet, all of that is serving communities holistically.
And I think that feels like a really interesting thing to explore is that moment where things did go wrong, and how can we process that? Like maybe let's take a step back and talk about what caused this shift to a place where we maybe felt like the media did serve us and in positive ways to this place where the media is broken and we're not even sure exactly what it is anymore. I know it might be easy for some people to say, oh, well, it was social media, right? It's the internet is what broke it all. But I'm not so sure that that's true. And I'm curious to hear what you both think about what actually did create this transition, this change in media's purpose.
I don't think it was built to succeed from the beginning. When I look at kind of the histories of news and journalism and media, and see that the first kind of business models for journalism were rooted in chattel slavery and the trafficking of humans, and that to me is not a business model or even a business model core that can be evolved into something that is successful. I think especially if we're moving towards a place where more people have access to freedom, more people have access to land and rights and civil good and all civic engagement, all of those things, then the business models and the systems that were created in something else were never really meant to thrive. They were never really meant to be kind of places where revenue or power was shared with workers or producers. That's just not how it was built. And it's both in the institution, but also in our public policy. I mean, when I think about the first broadcast licenses that were distributed in the US, right? They were distributed for free, but they were only distributed to white men. That's not a system that is going to thrive or be successful in the world that we live in now. So I'm not sure that there was like a place where it went wrong. I think one of the things that's happened just continuously is that more and more people are aware, more and more people have access to different kinds of information. Different kinds of information is more readily available. And when you're only fed cabbage every night, like you're gonna eat it because you need to eat. But when you realize that there is also carrots and there's celery and there's green beans and there's even things that aren't vegetables like that, then you're going to look to those things, right? Because this thing that you've been fed forever is maybe not your favorite and not the thing you want to engage with the most. And I think that's what's happening and what's been happening with our media system.
I also think that a lot of the issues that we identified have not really fixed, even though we've known about them for decades, right? I think something, for example, diversity, like back in the 60s, we were talking about how we needed more people of color in our newsrooms. In the 70s, like this wonderful book, Good Girls Revolt, kind of like documents how women had to push their way into like all these newsroom positions. The 70s were not that long ago, right? So we've known about these issues for a long time, but also like there's been a hesitancy to actually fix these things. And it's because, again, like it benefits people who have like an investment in keeping things as they are, right? I do think, going back to the piece of social media, which is like so often blamed for all this, I think it's kind of like a more complicated than what we talk about, right? Like in one hand, I do feel like social media has helped make journalism more democratic and hold people accountable when they fail communities, and have people also create their own spaces and be like, well, if no one is gonna cover my community accurately, then I'm gonna do it on my own. I'm gonna take this on my own hands, right? So that piece is important, but at the same time, because of the way a lot of these things have been built and the algorithms and who has built them, like a lot has, like, it has allowed for a lot of disinformation. And in the same way, like earlier we were talking about local newsrooms, of course, communities of color specifically are gonna look elsewhere for information because they did not trust how these local newsrooms were covering them in the first place. The local newsroom goes away, then you're just like looking for information elsewhere that feels appealing to you. And a lot of these disinformation efforts are specifically designed for like these communities. I think, for example, of like around the election, we saw so much disinformation being like distributed to the Hispanic community and in Miami and Florida. And a lot of it was like a concerted effort, like perfectly engineered to appeal to like mi tia and like people like that, right? So it's more complicated. And I feel like for an industry that's so interested in truth and finding the nuance of stuff, like we often don't use nuance to examine like where things have gone wrong and why things have not changed in certain ways.
And it's so interesting because I think that you hear, especially when you're talking about the media, this idea that there's, some wizard behind the curtain, that there's a conspiracy to try and, confuse people or confuse a certain population or, and the media, of course, as a whole, like there is that power to influence. And I think all the three of us, I'm sure, would agree that, in all of our roles in media, we use it to our advantage to try and present a certain message, to try and convey a certain point. But I think that what we've seen, especially recently, and perhaps because of social media, that the way that folks can manipulate that to use it for more nefarious purposes. And I wonder if there is this idea of the them behind the scenes who are sort of pulling the strings. When people ask that, like, I guess who is there a them? Like, is there some sort of group that is conspiring to make things go to create negative messaging? And I see you nodding, Alicia.
Yeah, I don't think that there is like one hand behind this like magical curtain somewhere, that there is like one person or small group of people that are like engineering this whole chaotic system. But I do think that I think in the same way that like folks don't have a collective definition of media, one of the things I see a lot in my work is that folks don't perceive media as a system or a structure that has levers for transformation and levers for change in the same way that they might perceive like the educational system or the criminal justice system or the like or any kinds of systems that we're familiar with, education. And so I think because of that, because there's like not that same kind of understanding and systemic transparency and clarity, that it can feel like that. And it makes sense that it would feel like that, because if you don't know how the sausage is made, you just assume there's some magic, some things happen, and then sausage, right? And that's the same thing that happens with media a lot of times. You're like, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of people, and then we get this. And either we get this thing that is like reflective of the realities that we live, or we more often, especially for communities of color and queer and trans communities and working class communities, we get stories that are not that are not reflective of the things that we live and the realities that we exist in. Part of how I came into work around journalism and around news was because I was seeing and experiencing the differences between just being in my family, right? I would be uptown participating in or witnessing some sort of protest, direct action, civic engagement that was happening. And I think specifically about in Charlotte back in 2016, there was a Black man, Keith Lamont Scott, who was murdered by the police. And I was able to be connected to some of those organizations that were kind of advocating and organizing and protesting that. But my mama wasn't. So she was getting all of her information from the TV. And I was staying with her at the time, and I would go uptown, do whatever, be in places, be in meetings, and then come home. And her story of what was happening was almost entirely different than the things I had witnessed and the things I had seen happen and the things I knew about. And it was, and she was getting her information from the news. she was like, and she would ask me, she'd be like, the news said this thing is happening. Is that true? And I'd have to be like, no, well, this is like what actually happened and da 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 da. And I just see that thing happen so much, where there is that confusion exists because there's a disconnect between what people engage with or what people learn in their kind of their news diet, and then what's happening and what people are experiencing and witnessing in real life. And then there are the people who are like, you know, a lot of the disinformation and misinformation originates in the dark web. That's people. That's not just a nebulous thing. There are people there who are creating it, right? I think about the fact that there are people who lobby against libraries, right? Like they don't want libraries to be funded. There are people who lobby and advocate against education. They don't want folks to have access to information in an equitable way. So I think about all those people who are a part of making these systems happen. And I think what we'll find if we map that out more is then we can understand, okay, like what are the relationships and where are the levers and where are there opportunities for shift and change? But until that's mapped out and clear to folks, then it's easy to just feel like there's like some magic sausage maker in the back making all the sausage for the world.
Yeah, I think a big part of this is too the lack of media literacy and understanding how journalism works and people kind of latching onto like news outlets or stuff that confirms their biases instead of like having a very diverse media diet, right? And that definitely happens. I've seen this a lot back home in Puerto Rico, where like what I'm reporting on versus like what some people are hearing is just, you know, like day and night. I'm like, mommy, where did you hear that? And she's like, well, the news. And I'm like, what news? So I think that trying to educate our communities is like so important, and at the same time regaining the trust of a lot of these communities. I think that's also why there's a lot of communities that have very deep, valid skepticism of like journalists, and I've seen this in my work. Like I cover immigration, for example, and I've had to make the case to people like, this is the type of work I do, and I'm not gonna expose you in any way, and my journalism is not gonna be extractive, like I just go in, take and go, because like that, you know, it makes people feel like they were used. And in many ways, more often than not, like people will see their quote taken out of context and they're like, that's not what I said, right? And it's very common for them to then feel like, well, I cannot trust any journalist, like I cannot participate in this process because these people don't really have my best interests at heart when they're covering me. So yeah, like I think there's like multiple levels. I do not think that there's like one shady person behind the scenes as a puppeteer, but I also do think that there's like obviously groups where certain interests that like are proliferating certain narratives. With CDIFs, for example, like I cover a lot of reproductive health, and when it comes to the conversation around abortion, like we do see a lot of misinformation come from like more often than not anti-abortion people, but also some pro-abortion people will also spill out some things that I'm like, that's the math, it's not mathing when we look at the research, right? And just like sifting through that and making sure that we give our audiences like the most complete version of the truth as we can, and like also they're aware of like our biases and our blind spots is like super important.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, one thing that comes to mind for me in having this conversation is through my work with TED, we had a talk from Carol Cadwalader, who's a journalist who sort of broke open Brexit, the story behind how Facebook was spreading misinformation and really targeting communities about the dangers in being part of the EU, which ultimately led to Brexit. And I think that there's this extra layer beyond just we go out, we create the media, right? And then there is social media. So I think for some people, the thinking is like, okay, maybe the journalists aren't the bad people, but it's, Mark Zuckerberg, right? It's Jack Dorsey. It's the people who are then the algorithm, I guess, who are then is taking the information we've created, targeting certain communities. And so I feel like in some ways, social media really adds this other element beyond just like, we can create media in a way that feels like it is, intended for good, intended to promote certain narratives. And then in the dissemination of it, somehow, I think there's a manipulation that may happen at that level. And so I'm curious, I guess, as journalists and as creators of media, how do you see a way to sort of fight against the algorithm, if you will, to the point you were mentioning, Alicia, and also Andrea too, that, talking about abortion clinics, and Alicia, when you talked about, your mother seeing something completely different than you're seeing, how do you guard against, I guess, the people who you hope would receive your information, your media, not actually receiving it?
I think a lot of it boils down to education. For example, when the pandemic started, my dad is like a man of science, very smart, and still he got this WhatsApp message saying something about like, if you hold your breath for 10 seconds, that means your lungs are fine. And a quick Google told me like that was not anything, it did not have anything to do with the virus. This was like some obscure doctor that just like kept passing it on WhatsApp, and it just became like this big chain, right? So I told him, like, whenever you read something, like, don't take a lot of these things as fact. And that's what we see a lot with like social media. Like there's been studies that say, like, it's absolutely bananas to me, but when people see, and I wish I knew the source of this, I do remember I heard about it, and You're Wrong About, a really good podcast. When people see an image with a quote over, like, on top of it, they tend to believe that's like, literally your brain will assume that it's like true. Like you have a picture of MLK saying something like Baskin Robbins is amazing, and then people will like assume like, oh yeah, MLK once said that like Baskin Robbins is amazing. And to me, it's like we need to really educate people so they check themselves, because there are things that are about, confirmation bias, and you just looking at things that will align with your worldview. And there's things that are more like literally in your brain and the way that your the neuroscience of like how you process stuff. So with education, hopefully, like media literacy, telling people, look for a certain like a diverse group of media outlets in your diet, right? Or telling my dad, like, Papi, like, use Google. It takes literally 10 seconds to just verify this with like a trusted source. I think that way we can push against some of this like disinformation that exists, because the algorithms, like, they did not come out of nowhere, right? Like they did just spring out. Like they are a product of people, and people are biased, and people have, different interests, and like a lot of times, like no one else is checking you on those biases. We've seen this a lot with facial recognition. The fact that facial recognition, like software cannot recognize people of color, specifically Black people, more often than not, it's insane. But it's not the algorithm that was like that out of the blue. It's like someone created it in a way that it's faulty because people are faulty.
Yeah, there's this really incredible organization that's doing work to transform algorithms called the Algorithmic Justice League. And I would really recommend their work, because it's been the times when I've been able to like peep into it, every time my mind is blown. And like, you know how sometimes you're in meetings and you're like, oh, I can like multitask here, or like, I know maybe what they're gonna say. Every time I listen to those folks talk, I'm like, I have to like be really focused and listen and take a lot of notes, because this algorithm thing is wild. And they do a really good job at connecting kind of the analog algorithms and how they were created in prior to the internet, prior to social media, and how that's informed the way that algorithms exist in the internet now. But I think the other piece of it is that is relationships, right? Like that's really the analog solution for me is relationships. And I think, when we think about segregation and gentrification and displacement, like those things have done really good jobs at making sure that folks aren't able to build relationships across different identities and across different experiences. And I think those relationships are so key because that's where we get to do some of that fact checking. In addition to kind of research, looking things up, if we're able to do that, the more often we're able to go to someone and say, like, do you know about this? Or have you heard about this? Or like, can you point me to more things about this? Or like, is this your lived experience? Then that also bolsters the ability to research, right? So if somebody like, and my mama comes over often. She lives next door. So she comes over often and is just asking me questions like, did you hear this? Did you know this? But if we didn't have that close relationship, she wouldn't be asking those questions of a different neighbor. And so I'm able to say like, yeah, like this is a thing, and like then show her, like be like, go look this thing up. But I think that it's really important to balance between the research and the relationship because our search engines are based on algorithms, right? It's like a full circle of things. And that, like, I remember learning recently that there is a different, the way that language evolves in communities that are considered more like liberal or left is a different evolution than words in conservative or right-wing communities or people who are not kind of, or who are more central. And so, for example, the term like social justice or privilege is a word that doesn't get used as often in like liberal or left communities because they, like, communities have moved on to other terms, gotten more specific. But because of that, when you go to research social justice or go to research privilege, a lot of the content that exists is from people saying like, this is a ploy, this is a scam, this is something that people are trying to get you to buy into, this is false, because that folks know that if I can get people at an entry level and stop them there, then it's easier to move them. And so I think for that reason too, there has to be more evergreen material that's created that is like very basic. Like if you are just coming into this issue or just learning about this thing, like here are the basics, and making that more accessible for folks. And I think it's like very broad, but it's also very specific. Like if you're reading a story about police violence, for example, it's really important to have context. It's really important to be able to link to something else or to look at something else to say like, oh, okay, like it's not just this story, this is happening in like a bigger system. And I know that like not all the time, not all of our journalists know those things, right? So it really does become this kind of like system institutional responsibility to figure out how do we create that evergreen content and material that folks can go back to for that entry level place.
I wanted to go, sorry, Whitney.
Oh no, go ahead, Andrea.
I wanted to go really quickly to the point Alicia was making about relationships. I think it's also from like our own positions as like journalists to create relationships with the communities we cover. Because again, like earlier I said that journalism can feel very extractive for communities, and when that happens, the distrust happens, then there's not as much, information that we can be getting. Like I think a lot of, for example, when we cover immigration, more often than not, like so many of the stories are, oh, this one person in crisis because of this horrible thing that happened, blah, 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 and very surface level, when a lot of times we could if we're embedded in the communities we're covering and like these issues, we can give the fuller picture and we can like really show the context. And at the same time, treat people as humans, treat our sources as humans, which seems so insanely basic, but so often many of our colleagues like just don't think that way. They just see you as a person who's gonna give me a quote, not like a person with a full lived experience who is much more than just like what happened to them or this one thing that they're experiencing in this moment. So in the same way that we create relationships with the people around us just to keep them in check and make sure that like the information they're receiving is accurate and everything, we also should be really thinking consistently about forming relationships with the communities we are embedded in.
And that actually answers my next question. And I'm curious to hear if there are other suggestions, but this idea of treating people like humans, developing relationships, as you've suggested, Andrea, and then Alicia, this idea of coming in at sort of a basic level to help people understand the most general information about a subject. I mean, are there other ways you think that media could better serve communities better than what we're seeing right now, and helping us sort of work through this changing landscape of media we're seeing right now?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the relationships piece, because that becomes community power, and community power is what either keeps or gets rid of community infrastructure. And so if we think about kind of journalism as a public utility or public good, it's going to be that community power that either sustains it or doesn't. And so in addition to like having a more humanizing and less extractive, more reparative journalism, it's also the only way that journalism exists in the future is if it's rooted and based on relationships. I'll also add that I think that to move towards kind of serving communities better and apologies.
No worries.
To move towards kind of serving communities better, I think there has to be an active approach towards repair. And that repair can look like kind of reckoning with information and being honest about the way that you've harmed folks in the past, acknowledging that, doing that research, but then also figuring out how to redress that and how to build in accountability mechanisms so that it doesn't happen again in the future. And I think that these relationships are really key for that accountability mechanism, because we can be honest about what we've done and what's been harmful and what we want to change. But if the relationships aren't in place for the accountability, then it's really easy to kind of slide back into old habits.
I would add that having a diverse newsroom, it's so important. And I know this is a conversation we've had a lot over the last year, but for a lot of communities, like when they look at your masthead, when they look at your bylines, like they're like, why am I even gonna come to you with my story? When clearly like here, like there are people who do not look like me, who probably don't have the same experience as me. Like, I feel like probably you could historically, treat my story in a way that's not accurate or fair, etc. But I also think that that's important because often if you come from a marginalized community, you're seen as biased, right? Like that's the baseline, because for some reason, objectivity is an idea that it's only often afforded to white men and white people, but people of color, queer people, like people who come from like low like income households, like they're not afforded the same thing, right? So having those people in your newsroom can be like a great check for your blind spots, and in that way your like reporting becomes stronger and it's less likely to be harmful, right? Like there's so many assumptions that we sometimes make because I don't know everything, and I'm sure that no one in this industry knows everything, right? So we are of course gonna have blind spots. So having people there who can like check you and you can go to as as an expert, it's like super important. Like that's something I heard someone once say, like, if there was a plane crash and you had a former pilot in your newsroom, you probably go to that person to like, get you information, help you shape a story, just have that institutional knowledge, like, because they're an expert, right? Well, that can be applied to people's identities as well. Like I cover Puerto Rico a lot, and I feel pretty confident that I'm gonna cover that in a way that's fair, but also like has all this context and it's accurate because I'm from the island. I grew up there. Like this is my lived experience. I have this wealth of information just by virtue of like growing up in this space, right? And that can be applied to so many other of our identities. So like, yeah, like I know that we've had a lot of conversations around diversity in the last year, but like it not only makes our journalism much better, but it's also a way to, repair the harm we've done and establish like strong relationships with the communities we're supposed to serve.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that real quick. I think to do those things also requires us as journalists, folks who are kind of in relationship to journalism somehow, media makers, news creators, to also be organized and to be in relationship with each other in a way that is kind of oriented towards building power and shifting towards these things. I think a lot of times I do trainings with newsrooms around how to be more engaged and how to build these relationships. And the question comes up all the time of like, but how do I make this the culture of the newsroom instead of like one person's job or one team's job? And a lot of that it's organizing. It's like, what is the education that folks need? What are the conversations, the one-on-one conversation? What is that's the thing that shifts the culture. What is the like thing that people need to see as possible so that they can like be inspired and be like, oh yeah, that is a great idea. But all of that is organizing. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so thankful for spaces like this is because it is a space where folks can be in relationship with each other, figure out how to kind of leverage and strategize across different newsrooms, across different institutions, different roles that folks play. To think about like, if this is a thing that we want to do, like if we want there to be more diverse newsrooms, if we want our newsrooms to reflect the demographics of our communities more often, then we can do that so much better together and across spaces and across roles than we can individually.
And so we've spent most of this time talking about how we can sort of support, foster movements within the media. And I think one big question, of course, is, this is one space, but how does that translate to other industries, to other spaces? If we implement some of these changes, how do you see that this will sort of reverberate out beyond just the media world?
I can say that since when we first started doing the work around media reparations, it was interesting because we had written and we had launched it with an essay, and the essay was predominantly about journalism and social media and other kinds of technology. So like afterwards, we released the essay. We had like journalists reach out, respond, newsrooms, like folks who had been doing work around social media and technology. But the thing that was really interesting to me and the thing that was more unexpected was that there were also people who were reaching out from from music industries or from like the music side of radio, or people who were reaching out from the entertainment industry to say like, yeah, like we see ourselves in that, or people in like the fashion industry. And so it started to kind of make me reimagine and rethink media, but also culture. Like these are all kind of culture creating, culture shifting industries and institutions. And so it's been really important, and we're kind of continuing to try to build these relationships across these industries, because one of the things that we know and we see is that the way that these various medias kind of make and create culture is then what informs policy and material reality and lived condition. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we can do a really good job across medias, across kind of culture creating institutions and industries to be in alignment and to move in alignment, then that will have a ripple effect across all kinds of other spaces that we just don't see currently. And there is also, I mean, there's like so much learning to do from all of those spaces, right? Like there's a lot of learning to do from social workers and educators and like nurses and doctors about like, how do you care for people? How do you respond to people's needs? Like, how do we shift these industries? So I think there's a lot of learning to do across all industries, but especially across all of these like culture shifting and creation spaces.
Yeah, I don't think I have much more to add because Alicia was like so wonderful. But I think in many ways, you know, media industries are reflected, like reflective of society. So a lot of the conversations that we're having in newsrooms and studios and stuff like are similar to conversations that are existing in other spaces. I think, you know, going back to the part of relationships, it's so groundbreaking to speak with people who are not journalists. It's like my favorite part of the day because like we're in such a bubble, and just having connections with people who exist in other industries and like learning from the challenges they have and how they tackle those, and then replicating those in our newsrooms and having that exchange of information can be super empowering. So I think it boils down to, you know, breaking out of our bubble, which more often than not, like as many journalists, like the majority of the people they interact with are fellow journalists. So breaking out of that bubble and really building those relationships out, like I think it's a way to have that, you know, two-way street of information going.
I 100% agree with what both of you have said. I feel like the media, you know, I got involved in media because I feel like it is everything. It's like, you know, everything we know, everything we understand about our world and even ourselves, it comes from media, you know, whether you think about it as television or, you know, entertainment, books, and just however you get information, that it shapes so much of you. So it feels like starting at the top, which is media, that trickles down to so many spaces. Well, so I want to open the floor to questions from the room, but before I do that, I just have one last question for right now, which is just, I guess, you know, about thinking about all these things we've just talked about. Like, what is your vision for what a transformed media looks like? You know, what is the goal that we're working towards? What is, if you know, could sort of distill it into you know, a small paragraph, you know, how do you see media working really well in the future?
I was asked a similar question at a different panel not that long ago. And I think in many ways, it has to start at home. And that what that means is like empowering our workers, like making sure that we change a lot of our institutions to make them more equitable. And in that way, like, you know, when people don't have the fear of speaking out because you don't want to be the rabble rouser who's pointing out that, you know, you covered this police shooting in a horrible way. Like when you empower your workers, like that's also gonna make your journalism and your media better, because like they're gonna feel much more empowered to speak up when things are not going right, but also when things are going right, and be like, hey, if this worked out, like maybe we should create all this other things. So just like when it starts at home, I think that at the end of the day, our audiences like feel those changes, like they do see the information that comes out and like the stories that come out in a different way, because like, you know, things are much more equitable and in our newsrooms.
Yeah, I think that my vision for the future of news and media is that our communities own the infrastructure of our media infrastructure. And I think that can look like financial material ownership. There's a lot of models around that, but I think it can also look like this, like having more of a sense of ownership in the infrastructure, having more input, having more public accountability, those kinds of things. So I think it's like ownership and like all of the ways that ownership can look like, and it's like public, and it's also like workers and producers of news and information. I think a lot about a future where Black folks are able to steward Black stories from ideation to creation to production to distribution. And I think that's important for all communities, for all all communities have that ability to be able to hold stories that are true to your community, from ideation to distribution. A lot of times right now, that's not possible. When folks are trying to tell Black stories or queer stories or Puerto Rican stories or Indigenous stories, or like anything that intersects and overlaps there, it has to go through white hands before it can get back to the people who you're already in community with. And so I envision a future where that's not the case, where maybe that does happen sometimes, but there are opportunities. And right now there's not really a lot of opportunities for that, not in a platformed way.
Well, so I'd love to open the floor for others. I'm sure there are lots of people who'd love to dive in and have questions. So you feel free to, if you have a question, in fact, I see Kylie's put in the chat, you can ask your question in the chat, or you can turn on your video to ask a question yourself. So I'll just take a step back to see if anyone's turning on their video to ask a question. And if you do, you can do that, and I'll call on you once I see you.
Do we have to show the video?
You don't have to, Karen. I can get us started. There is one in the chat from Lisa Hetfield, and then Karen, I can throw it to you as well. But Lisa Hetfield asks, how do you see the role of public radio and public TV going forward as a force for change?
I can start by saying I saw that question, and it just made me think that, public radio and public television is, like, for me, one of the biggest opportunities and heartwarming spaces, and also like one of the biggest heartbreaks simultaneously, because public radio is and public TV both, right? These are places where there have long been these ideas of membership and community membership being in communities kind of having stake in news and information and journalism, right? That's a good model. There are places that have learned how to take public money, to take government money, and still produce accurate journalism, right? Like, that's a really good skill and really important for the future of journalism. And at the same time, like, some of the pieces around extraction and around disproportionately prioritizing whiteness or prioritizing men or white college educated men, like that thing still happens in public TV and public radio. And so I think if we can hold those pieces that are so good, those pieces about being community supported and community held, those pieces about being able to kind of alchemize and transform government money and not be influenced though by government, like, those are, if we can take those skills and do them without the disproportionate, like, bent towards whiteness, I think there'll be, like, something amazing there. And I'm really excited for what that looks like. And I know there's, like, over the past year, there's been different kinds of, some of the movements and reckonings around the future of news and future of journalism have come from public radio, specifically have come from people either currently in public radio or formerly in public radio. And those have been, there's been, like, a public radio for all campaign. There's been, like, there was a kind of a blueprint that a person named Celeste Headley put out that was really this blueprint for transformation in public radio. And so I think if we are able to transform and figure out what that transformation of public radio looks like, then there'll be so many lessons there for the rest of journalism, for the rest of media and technology.
Okay, so I'll ask my question. Thank you guys for coming. And I'm just, in a kitchen with a lot of dishes and things going on. So don't think you guys really want to see all that. But I wanted to ask, just in dealing with folks, young women who are starting out in the industry, I feel like this is, like, I've been in the industry for more than 25 years. And so I feel like, it's such a different time, and a lot of people want to be active, especially women of color. They want to be sort of straddling this advocacy role versus, like, being the reporter. And I'm struggling with how to help people get into the business and get real jobs, because people are doing like these freelancing, not really getting paid, not really experiencing, journalism in a healthy way. I mean, you're seeing all these stories about burnout, like this craziness happening, where people are like falling apart and nobody's really helping them. So I guess I'm trying to figure out like what can I tell? Like when I was starting, it was like, okay, go get a job at a small newspaper and learn everything, right? Learn like how to cover all the different beats and get all the skills. And I still strongly believe in those skills. That you have to have your journalism skills, you have to have your writing together, you have to practice at a standard. But it's just really hard for people to break into the industry now. And I feel like everyone who is successful is performing at a really high, intimidating level. Like you guys are like out there, like y'all are like people, you have almost like this whole brand thing. And that doesn't diminish you because you know the work. But when you don't have all that, it just is overwhelming.
I can take this one. I know you just said that, but I have like massive imposter syndrome consistently. I'm always like, oh my God, like people come to me and they're like, oh, how do you do this? And I'm like, I have no idea. I'm like consistently flailing. But to go back to the question about like mentoring these people and helping them, yeah, I feel like we are it's like a really heartbreaking spot, especially if you come from like a marginalized community. Like if you don't have the connections, if you did not go to the right school, if you were not right school and like big quotation marks, if you maybe did not get that like free internship because basically you were not getting paid anything and you could not say yes to that, I think it can be really hard to start. What I recommend is that you leverage your connections, like to help these people, right? Like if you're in this, like you said that you've been in the industry for about 20 years, like introducing people, like your mentees or people to others, like it can be quite life-changing. Like that's what a lot of people have done for me, just like lifting up opportunities of, hey, like I saw this fellowship, like you might be a good fit, let's work together in your application packet, and I'll just like forward your name to this person because I have a little bit more pull. And just like also being realistic about the realities of the industry. I do that a lot with my mentees where I'm like, freelancing, it's hard work. Like if you cannot just survive on freelance reporting, here are other things you could be doing to supplement your income, like just do translating, copy editing, like there are other things that pay much better than journalism and that will help you support like the type of work you want to do. But also I think, and I think I'm gonna wrap up with this and get off my soapbox, just really forging those connections and encouraging people can also be very, very empowering. Like there's been so many times where I'm like, I cannot do this anymore, I'm out. I'm going back home and opening like a beach bar or something because like I'm over it. And having that one person who is like, no, let's step by step back, like what are your interests, what do you want to do next, like how can I help you get there? It can be life-changing, and that can be really hard when you're the mentor, because obviously in a year like this one specifically, you're dealing with so much more. But yeah, just like really I would, and I'll share like leveraging your connections and like making those intros, really helping people with their application packets and everything, but also letting them know things that are normal for us but they might not know. I tell my mentees like, oh yeah, get on a phone with the editor to talk about ideas instead of just like cold pitching. And so many of them looked at me like, what? Like no one told me this was even like an option. So also like that's institutional knowledge. Like you might assume your mentee knows, but like just in case, throw it in there, and that can also help them. And I'll stop now.
Thanks. I just want to follow up with that. Do you ever feel like have you ever had a case where you had to tell somebody, or you felt like maybe they just were not cut out? Or do you always, like I just always want to fight for the person who wants to do it, right? Like, I feel like journalism is kind of like one of those passions that I just can't bring myself to tell somebody. But it's just that sometimes people are so far behind, you know, and I almost feel like, is it cruel to send this person forward, or should I just sort of help them with the fight? You know, like, it's just, I don't want to ever.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. What I do and what I've done, I've talked with people who have tried everything, right? Like, they have been applying to jobs for 3 years, like, or, you know, they've been trying to freelance and like they barely bite. Like, it's really hard and it's really upsetting. What I tell my mentees is that I will fight for them until the moment that they say, okay, I'm done. And like really having that, like asking themselves to like have that really hard conversation of them sitting down being like, this is my limit, like it's not worth trying to break into the industry because you have rent to pay and you have bills to pay and like student loans possibly. And, you know, like a lot of like journalism is important and I love journalism, but so many of our skills are transferable to other spaces that are not gonna break our heart and that are gonna pay so much more. So having that conversation with the mentee of like, just be realistic of where you are at right now, and I will support you until the point you say like, se acabó ya, like I'm done, I want to do the next thing. Because I never want to be that person who tells someone like you cannot do it, right? Because I had people do that to me and it can be like really upsetting. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
And if I could just add, like, I feel like there's also an element there of like making sure that you're sort of taking this incrementally, and maybe it's not like, you know, I need to do this or bust, but if the thought process is like, okay, I'm going to do this right now, and maybe this is only 10% of what I hope to ultimately be doing, but then I can build on that and do a little bit more. Like I found that in my own life that's sort of the way that, you know, I look at it as stepping stones to greater things. And that's advice I always offer to folks too, is to sort of, to not always think that if you haven't fully reached what you think is the end goal and right out the gate, that it's a lost cause, and to sort of have some patience around getting to that final goal.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you so much.
I'll hop back on to read another great question in the chat from Megan, who asks, do you have any advice to leverage media to drive diversity and inclusion in a corporate setting? I work in the communications department at a financial services company.
One of the things I was thinking about reading that is developing relationships with media makers and journalists, and figuring out what you or your corporation or the industry's information needs are, right? Like, I think at its core, it comes down to this kind of information needs question of like, what do people need to know to shift? What information, what data, what context, all of those kinds of things. And being in relationship with journalists and media makers is a place where you can either ask for those things, or folks can point you in the direction to say, oh yeah, we like produced this whole packet. And people are like very quick to tell you they already produced that whole packet of things. And so I feel like building up those relationships is really important and really key, because then there's like sharing that can happen there, or kind of like leveraging of like the institution or the platform or whatever. And also thinking about like who are people going to trust, right? Like some folks are gonna trust the Forbes more than they trust a Yes magazine. And some people, it's the exact opposite. They're like gonna be really skeptical about a Forbes and be like, yes, the Yes magazine is where it's at. And so also thinking about like, what are the kinds of media and journalism that folks are gonna respond to, and therefore like who and how do I need to build those relationships and those pathways is also really key.
Hi, I'm Beth. I wanted to ask, so I'm a white woman, right? I'm Jewish. I work in PR and I work for a nonprofit. And the PR shop that I work for is a Black-owned small business with all Black-owned clients. And I am the white hands that things pass through. And I often think about that. And I often think about my place as a part of the story of uplifting other voices, but recognizing the voice that I have and what I bring in PR and as a white person. And so I'm curious with what you guys think about really the transitional role of like white people right now in storytelling and in finding themselves as a part of the journey, because I'm trying to find my own place in it still. And, you know, I've been out of school 10 years doing this for a while, but I'm finding myself in a new place every day within this journey.
I can tell you a little bit from like the journalistic perspective. The fact that you have that awareness like just puts you like a million steps ahead of so many people. I think about this a lot in my own reporting, right? Like when I cover immigration, like as a Puerto Rican, I don't go through the immigration system, despite what some people think, because Puerto Ricans are US citizens. So how do I treat those stories with care and respect, and in a way that's not extractive and in a way that uplifts their voices, right? And just the fact that you ask yourself that question, it's like incredible, because some people don't even have that awareness. The other thing I do is like ask people in these communities, like how can I help them, right? Like, what do you need? Like, I'm here, like, what do you need from me? Like, in which ways, like, could I screw up, you know? Like, that's another thing. Like, how do I treat these things with care? And just that can be like a tricky thing to navigate, because some people will tell you like you should figure that on your own, like I am not here to educate you, and that's completely fair. But there's people who will appreciate that, of like, and feel empowered to tell you, okay, so as you create this like ad campaign or whatever, I feel like we should be hitting these things, and here's why. So let's make sure that, I don't know, I don't do PR, so let's make sure that we bring this to the client, like everything's okay, right? So just like just doing that journey and that self-examination consistently of understanding your role and your privilege in a certain community, and how not to be harmful is like a great first step.
Yeah, I'll add that I think that figuring out ways to, I mean, like already being in this space and thinking about like how can I be in mentorship relationships? How can I be in like these skill building relationships where I'm like equipping folks with what I have and the knowledge and the skill set that I have, so that like these folks could be in this position either here or somewhere else or wherever that might be. I think it's also really important in some of these roles, because I think in like in a reparative future where there are more like Black and brown folks who have more leadership and agency and autonomy, I think it's existing in a pluralist society, right? So it doesn't mean that there's no white leadership and there's like no white people, because that's not the future that I'm envisioning. Maybe like in some places, some communities, I don't know. That's like what some folks want, and that's fair and that's okay, because folks are like, I like need to retreat. And I think one of the ways that we get to these like pluralistic organizations is by power sharing, and figuring out like, am I the only one who has to who needs to hold this role, or can this role be like split into two people? And then how do we, and I think that's also a really good opportunity for like apprenticeship and some of that skill sharing and skill building. But doing that power sharing work and figuring out like what are the, like if you are in those places, are there ways that, like what are the ways that you can be more steeped in kind of Black media and Black spaces, and really counteract some of the media that has produced kind of white supremacist culture, and push back against it. And also to be thinking about like, what are the organizations or institutions that need to be created elsewhere, or in addition to this, how to build up and bolster those things, and how to leverage, like, and take risk, whatever that means, right? And I think that's one of the greatest pieces of being able to kind of be an accompliceship and allyship and these like these movements towards more racial justice, is to think about, like, where are the places where I can take risks that other people can't, and how do I leverage that in a way that makes it easier for the other folks around me, specifically for the Black and brown folks around me. And so I think that's a lot of different ways, and I think we're going to have to keep, like, figuring it out, because oftentimes it's the people who aren't asking that question who we really need to move the most. And so I think that's the other piece, is, like, are there people you can talk to that, like, you have a relationship with, to be like, you're the one that needs to move? They, like, you haven't heard it from these folks who've been trying to tell you, but I want you to hear it from my white mouth that you are the person, because it's gonna be heard differently, and it's gonna be taken differently. And so thinking about how to be supportive in those ways, I think, is super key.
All right, we have one more question in the chat, and I think it will be our last, just given the time, although I would keep you guys here all night if I could, but out of respect for you, I will not. But Emily Heron asks, in addition to the pressure that comes with working to diversify and transform media, how do you make or manage the decisions around how much time you invest in learning new mediums for communication?
So I'm a writer. I don't think I've done a lot of additional learning on other mediums. But I am also a journalist. I'm very, like, curious about the world. So I think that it's a matter of knowing your own limits. And that's something I've been learning more recently, is you have the power to say no. You don't have to take on like all these new projects, all these new initiatives. Like, you can make space to nurture yourself and pursue the things that, you know, are interesting to you. In many ways, like, this is something I did this big investigation around domestic violence back home. And though I had covered the issue, I had not really like when the word in Spanish would empaparse, but, like, I had not really been steeped into it, like, as much as I wanted in order to prepare myself for this big project. So instead of trying to cover other things, I just started, like, you know, doing a lot of research, and, like, this became kind of like my second thing. Like, I would read books and everything, and, like, just try to learn as much as I wanted, because, like, I wanted the story to be fair and complete and have context and everything. And that was a decision I made super early on. And you can make that type of decision with learning new mediums as well, and be like, okay, so this is what interests me now. In order to pursue this is probably what I have to leave behind for a little bit, because I don't want to be burned out, and, like, balance this out in a way that, you know, can feel enriching, can feel like you're growing as a media maker, as a reporter, etc., without necessarily pushing yourself to the extreme, because once you are in that point, it's really difficult to come back from burned out. So just, like, I think that it boils down to being honest with yourself about your capacities.
All right, well, we are coming to the end of this wonderful conversation. Andrea, Whitney, Alicia, thank you so much. Such an important, a transformative, timely conversation. All the good words, can't fit them into this thank you. We are so honored to have you share your insights and your work with us, and so grateful for the time and expertise and brilliance you've given us all tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. I also want to thank, of course, all of our mentors, mentees, speakers, alums, IWL staff and friends, everyone who makes this program possible and who gives so much to our events and our initiatives. We are so grateful to work with you and learn from you and to build community with you. As many of our mentors and mentees know, this event does mark the end of our formal program year, but please know that you are always a part of this community. I'll be in touch soon to wrap things up, so you're not done with me just yet. And we, of course, hope to see all of you in the fall as we welcome a new group of mentors and mentees, and hopefully see some of you mentors back next year as well. Again, Whitney, Alicia, Andrea, thank you so very much. Thank you all for being here tonight. Best wishes, everyone. Take care, and I will see you all in the new program year. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you.